Hello everyone. Before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the whispers of the unknown guide you through the eerie corridors of our story. Ready to face the darkness, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the highway bathed in the cold light of a crescent moon. Clara adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a fleeting glimpse of her tired eyes and the dark stretch of Black Ridge Road behind her. The drive home had been longer than usual, the evening meeting running overtime, and she now found herself alone on a road she rarely traveled at night. The stretch of Black Ridge Road was infamous among the locals. Twisting through dense, overgrown woods, it was known for its isolation and the strange stories whispered about its darkened lanes. Clara had never paid much attention to the tales, dismissing them as folklore meant to spook tourists or entertain children. Tonight, though, with the road eerily empty and her headlights cutting through the thick veil of mist, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. The first sign of trouble came as a faint distortion in her radio's reception. Clara's favorite playlist, streaming from her phone, was interrupted by a burst of static. She frowned, glancing at her phone mounted on the dashboard. The signal bar flickered, dropping to zero despite the clear night sky. She tapped the screen, but the static persisted, rising in pitch before abruptly cutting off altogether. A chill settled over her as silence filled the car, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under her tires. Clara tried to shake the unease, telling herself it was nothing more than a technical glitch. But then she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the road. Her heart skipped a beat as her headlights illuminated the outline of a man. He stood unnaturally still, partially obscured by the mist that clung to the trees. Clara instinctively slowed the car, her grip tightening on the wheel. The man's face was obscured by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat, his long coat hanging limply as though weighed down by the damp night air. What the hell? She muttered under her breath, her eyes locked on the figure. He made no move to signal her, no wave or gesture for help. He simply stood there, his presence unnerving in its stillness. Clara hesitated, her mind racing. Should she stop and offer assistance? The stories of Black Ridge Road echoed in her memory, warning her against it. Her gut told her to keep driving, and she pressed her foot gently on the accelerator. As her car passed the man, she kept her gaze fixed on him, half expecting him to turn or react. But he didn't move. Once she was a few hundred yards down the road, Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure fading into the mist. Instead, the road behind her was empty. The man was gone. Her pulse quickened. "You're imagining things," she told herself, gripping the wheel tighter. "Just keep driving." The minutes stretched on, the road winding through dense woods that seemed to press in closer with each passing mile. The mist grew thicker, clinging to the windshield despite the wipers swiping back and forth. Clara's unease deepened, the feeling of being watched gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. And then she saw him again. This time, the man stood in the middle of the road, his silhouette stark against the glare of her high beams. Clara slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the damp pavement as the car came to a screeching halt. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stared at the figure. He hadn't moved an inch, his posture unchanged from before. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his face, and his hands hung loosely at his sides. "What do you want?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He simply stood there, blocking her path. Clara's mind raced. She considered reversing and taking another route, but she wasn't sure she'd even passed a turnoff in miles. The thought of stepping out of the car sent a shiver down her spine. Summoning her courage, Clara honked the horn. The sharp sound echoed through the empty forest, but the man didn't flinch. He remained eerily still, as though he were carved from stone. "Move!" she shouted, her voice cracking. Her words seemed to have no effect. Clara's frustration bubbled over. and she shifted the car into reverse. The wheel spun momentarily on the slick pavement before the car began to back away slowly. The figure grew smaller in the beam of her headlights, but as she adjusted the angle of her road view mirror, her blood ran cold. He was there again, standing directly behind her car. Clara slammed on the brakes, her hands trembling as she fumbled to shift back into drive. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening with panic. She refused to look at the road view mirror again, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. When she hit the gas, the car surged forward, the figure disappearing into the mist behind her. The road twisted and turned. But no matter how far she drove, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the engine's hum and the faint sound of her own ragged breathing. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as she fought to keep the car steady on the winding road. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. Clara's head snapped to the side, her heart leaping into her throat. A shadow darted between the trees, keeping pace with her car. It was fleeting, barely visible in the periphery, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through her. She pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine roaring as she sped down the desolate road. But the faster she went, the more persistent the shadow became. It moved with unnatural speed, flitting between the trees as though it were part of the mist itself. Clara's grip on the wheel tightened as she pushed the car to its limits, the needle on the speedometer climbing higher and higher. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice echoing in the enclosed space of the car. As if in response, the shadow darted closer, emerging from the woods and running alongside her car. Clara's breath hitched as she caught a glimpse of it, a humanoid shape, but wrong. Its movements were jerky, as though it were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Its face was indistinct, blurred and featureless, yet it exuded an overwhelming sense of malice. Clara swerved, the tires screeching as the car veered dangerously close to the edge of the road. The shadow disappeared again, melting into the mist. She pressed on, her pulse pounding in her ears, her mind racing with a single thought: escape. The miles blurred together as Clara drove, the car's engine protesting against the relentless pace. The mist grew thicker, swallowing the road and the trees, until it felt as though she were driving through an endless void. The shadow was gone, but the sense of dread remained, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the mist began to lift. The trees thinned, revealing the faint glow of distant lights. Clara's heart leapt with relief as she realized she was nearing the edge of the forest. She eased off the accelerator, the car's speed dropping as the road straightened out. For the first time in what felt like hours, Clara allowed herself to breathe. She glanced in the road view mirror, half expecting to see the shadow lingering behind her. But the road was empty, stretching back into the darkness. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly as the lights ahead grew brighter, signaling the approach of a small town. But just as she began to relax, a new sound filled the car. It was faint at first, barely audible over the engine's hum, but it grew louder, clearer, until there was no mistaking it. The rhythmic tap of footsteps echoing from somewhere impossibly close. Clara's hands tightened on the wheel as her eyes darted to the passenger side window. The glass reflected her pale, frightened face in the empty road beyond. But the sound persisted, relentless and unyielding, as though something unseen was keeping pace with her car. She refused to look again. She couldn't. Instead, she focused on the lights ahead, her sole beacon of hope in the darkness. The footsteps continued, their cadence never faltering, until she finally crossed the threshold into the town. The street lights washed over her car, banishing the shadows that had clung to her throughout the drive. The footsteps stopped. Clara pulled into a gas station on the edge of town, her hands trembling as she turned off the engine. The silence was deafening, but it was no longer oppressive. It was the silence of safety, of normalcy. She leaned back in her seat, her chest heaving as she tried to calm herself. But as she sat there, her heart still racing, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly alone. Somewhere, out in the darkness, The silent stalker of Black Ridge Road was still watching. Clara sat in the gas station's parking lot, her trembling hands still gripping the steering wheel. The rhythmic footsteps had stopped, but their phantom echoes lingered in her mind, playing over and over like a macabre melody. The lights of the small town offered some comfort, their warm glow banishing the shadows that had chased her through the mist. Yet, a gnawing sense of unease remained, as though the silent stalker was still nearby, watching, waiting. Taking a deep breath, Clara forced herself to release the wheel and step out of the car. The cool night air hit her like a slap, and she hugged her jacket tighter around her body. The gas station was nearly deserted, save for a bored-looking attendant behind the counter and an elderly man nursing a cup of coffee at one of the picnic tables. Clara's footsteps echoed on the pavement as she walked toward the station, each step feeling heavier than the last. The attendant glanced up as she entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was young, probably in his early 20s, with a mop of unkempt hair and a name tag that read Kyle. His bored demeanor shifted to mild curiosity as Clara approached the counter. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. Clara hesitated, debating how much to share. "You could say that," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I think someone was following me." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "On Black Ridge Road." The mention of the road sent a chill down Clara's spine. "How did you know?" He shrugged, leaning on the counter. "People come in here all the time with stories about that road. Weird stuff happens out there. Figures in the mist, shadows that don't quite look right. Most folks just laugh it off. But," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window, "sometimes they're not laughing." Clara swallowed hard. "Do you think it's real?" "The stories." Kyle's expression turned serious. "I don't know. But if you were out there alone at night, I'm not surprised you're shaken up. That place gives me the creeps, and I've lived here my whole life." The elderly man at the picnic table cleared his throat, drawing their attention. He motioned for Clara to join him, his weathered face etched with lines that spoke of a long and difficult life. Reluctantly, she walked over, her curiosity outweighing her apprehension. "You saw him, didn't you?" the man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Clara froze. "Saw who?" The man's eyes met hers, and she saw a flicker of recognition, as though he knew exactly what she'd experienced. The man in the mist, the one who doesn't belong. A shiver ran down Clara's spine. "I don't know what I saw," she admitted, "but he was there." And then he wasn't. The man nodded slowly. "They call him the Silent Stalker. Been seen on Black Ridge Road for decades, maybe longer. Always the same, a man in a hat and coat, standing just where you least expect him. Sometimes is on the side of the road, sometimes in the middle of it, and sometimes," his voice dropped to a whisper, "sometimes is closer than you think." Clara's stomach turned. "What does he want?" The man shook his head. "Nobody knows. Some say he's a ghost, the spirit of someone who died on that road. Others think he's something else, something older. But one thing's for sure, if he's marked you, he'll follow you. You might think you left him behind, but he'll always find you." Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "How do I stop him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The man leaned back, his gaze distant. "Some say you can't. The best you can do is stay in the light, keep moving, and never look back." The weight of his words settled over Clara like a heavy blanket. She wanted to dismiss them, to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but the memory of the figure on the road, the shadow in the mist, and the relentless footsteps refused to be ignored. Kyle approached, holding a cup of coffee. "Hey," he said, setting it down in front of her. "On the house. You look like you could use it." Clara managed a weak smile. "Thanks." The warmth of the coffee seeped into her hands, offering a small measure of comfort. She sipped it slowly, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of everything. The silent stalker, the man in the mist, the feeling of being watched. It all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. After a few minutes, Clara stood, her resolve hardening. She couldn't stay here forever, and she couldn't let fear paralyze her. If the stalker was truly following her, she needed to keep moving. She thanked Kyle and the elderly man before returning to her car, her footsteps echoing in the still night air. As she climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, Clara glanced in the rearview mirror. The gas station's lights cast long shadows across the parking lot, but there was no sign of the stalker. For now, she was alone, but the man's words lingered in her mind. He'll always find you. Clara pulled onto the road, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness. The town faded behind her as she drove, the forest closing in once again. She turned the radio on, desperate for any distraction, but the static returned almost immediately, filling the car with its grating, hollow sound. Frustrated, she turned it off, the silence amplifying every creak and groan of the vehicle. The mist began to thicken, swirling around the car like a living thing. Clara gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she focused on the road ahead. The shadows seemed to move at the edges of her vision, but she refused to look, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, just as she began to feel the weight of exhaustion creeping in, she saw him again. The stalker stood at the edge of the road, his silhouette barely visible through the fog. Clara's breath hitched, and she instinctively slowed the car. Her mind screamed at her to keep driving, but something about his presence rooted her in place. This time, he wasn't alone. A second figure stood behind him, smaller and indistinct, their forms shrouded in the mist. "No," Clara whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But the figures didn't vanish. They remained, their stillness more menacing than any overt action. Clara's pulse raced as she pressed her foot down on the accelerator, the car surging forward. As she passed them, she felt an icy chill wash over her, as though she'd driven through a pocket of freezing air. When she glanced in the rearview mirror, the figures were gone. Clara's grip on the wheel tightened as she sped down the road, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. The silent stalker wasn't just a story, and he wasn't alone. Whatever was happening on Black Ridge Road, it was far from over. The mist was unrelenting as Clara continued her drive along Black Ridge Road, her headlights barely cutting through the dense fog. The further she went, the more the world seemed to shrink, the forest pressing in on either side and the road stretching endlessly ahead. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was venturing deeper into a place where the normal rules of reality didn't apply. Her mind raced with questions, but the memory of the two figures she'd seen kept interrupting her thoughts. The silent stalker wasn't supposed to have a companion. At least, none of the stories she'd heard had mentioned one. Who, or what, was the smaller figure? And why did their stillness feel so much more menacing than movement ever could? Clara's pulse quickened every time her gaze strayed to the rearview mirror. The road behind her remained empty, but the absence of anything didn't bring her comfort. The weight of the old man's words at the gas station echoed in her mind. "He'll always find you." The silence in the car felt oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of the tires against the asphalt. She'd tried the radio again, but the static had returned almost immediately, a harsh, grating sound that felt like nails on a chalkboard. Even her phone offered no reprieve, its screen displaying no service in bold letters that seemed to mock her. She was entirely alone, or so she wanted to believe. The fog thickened further, coiling around the car like a living thing. Clara's fingers tightened on the wheel as the road curved sharply to the left. She slowed the car, her eyes straining to make out the edges of the pavement. The trees on either side loomed larger, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to grab her. The mist seemed to take on a life of its own, swirling in unnatural patterns that made her feel dizzy if she stared too long. And then she saw it again. A shadow moved through the mist, darting between the trees to her right. It was fleeting, a mere flicker at the edge of her vision, but it was enough to send her heart racing. Clara's breathing quickened as she scanned the woods, her eyes searching for any sign of movement. The shadow was gone, but the unease it left behind lingered, seeping into her bones. "Just keep driving," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Don't stop. Don't look back." Her foot pressed down on the accelerator, the car picking up speed as she rounded another bend. The road straightened out, and for a moment, Clara allowed herself to hope that she might finally be leaving the worst of it behind. But then the car jerked violently to the side, the wheel pulling out of her hands as if an unseen force had grabbed it. Clara screamed, gripping the wheel tightly as she fought to regain control. The car skidded, the tires squealing against the damp pavement, before coming to a stop just inches from the edge of the road. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat frozen, her hands trembling on the wheel. "What the hell was that?" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breathing. She looked around, her eyes darting from the trees to the road and back again. There was nothing, no sign of what had caused the car to veer off course. But as she sat there, the oppressive silence returned, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Reluctantly, Clara stepped out of the car, her boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. The cold night air bit at her skin, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her as she walked to the front of the car. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the mist obscured everything beyond a few feet. She knelt down to inspect the tires, half expecting to find a puncture or some other explanation for the sudden swerve. The tires were fine. There was no debris on the road, no sign of an animal darting in front of her. Clara's stomach twisted with unease as she straightened up, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods. The trees stood silent and unmoving, their dark forms blending into the mist. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck that refused to be ignored. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The sound echoed faintly before being swallowed by the fog. No response. Clara turned to head back to the car, but as she did, something caught her eye. On the passenger side window, faint and blurry, was the outline of a handprint. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, her mind racing. It hadn't been there when she got out. She was sure of it. Panic surged through her as she scrambled back into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it with shaking hands. She glanced around the car, her eyes darting to the back seat, but it was empty. The handprint on the window had begun to fade, as though it had never been there at all. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, Clara knew better. Whatever was happening on Black Ridge Road wasn't just in her head. The stalker, or something else entirely, was toying with her, testing her resolve. She started the engine, the sound breaking the oppressive silence, and pulled back onto the road. The miles stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. The mist showed no signs of lifting, and the shadows at the edge of her vision grew bolder, darting closer to the car before disappearing again. Clara's grip on the wheel was so tight that her knuckles ached, but she couldn't bring herself to loosen her hold. Her headlights caught something up ahead, and Clara's stomach dropped. It was another figure, standing motionless in the middle of the road. This one was smaller than the stalker, its form indistinct and shrouded in mist. Clara's instinct screamed at her to stop, but her foot pressed harder on the accelerator instead. The figure didn't move as the car barreled toward it, and for a horrifying moment, she was certain she would hit it. But just as the car reached the figure, it vanished. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the car passed through empty air, the mist parting briefly before closing in again. She glanced in the rear view mirror, but there was nothing there. Only response was the low growl of the engine and the relentless hum of the tires on the pavement. As the road twisted and turned, Clara's thoughts grew more frantic. She couldn't keep driving like this, not without a destination. She needed to find help, or at least a place to stop and think. But the road offered no signs, no exits, no indication of where it might lead. It was as if she were caught in an endless loop, trapped on Black Ridge Road with no way out. The mist began to thin slightly, revealing a faint glow in the distance. Clara's heart leapt at the sight, hope surging through her chest. It looked like a house, its windows glowing warmly against the darkness. She pressed on, the car's engine roaring as she closed the distance. As she approached, the outline of the house became clearer. It was small and unassuming, nestled among the trees like a beacon of safety. Clara pulled into the gravel driveway, her tires crunching loudly in the still night. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It felt too good to be true, but she had no other choice. Gathering her courage, Clara stepped out of the car and approached the front door. The warm glow from the windows spilled onto the porch, and for the first time in hours, she felt a flicker of relief. She knocked, the sound echoing faintly. The door creaked open, and a middle-aged woman appeared, her expression one of mild surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice kind but wary. Clara hesitated, unsure how to explain what had happened. I'm sorry to bother you," she began, "but I've been driving on Blackridge Road, and I think someone's been following me." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "You look like you've been through hell." Clara stepped inside, the warmth of the house washing over her like a balm. But even as the door closed behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly escaped Blackridge Road. Not yet. The warmth of the small house enveloped Clara like a blanket, momentarily pushing away the oppressive chill of Blackridge Road. The living room was cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and the scent of freshly brewed tea. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, its glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. The middle-aged woman who had opened the door motioned for Clara to sit on a well-worn sofa. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the woman said, her voice tinged with concern as she handed Clara a steaming cup of tea. Clara managed a weak smile. "I'm not sure what I've seen," she admitted, her hands trembling as she took the cup. "But something out there, it's not right." The woman nodded knowingly and introduced herself as Margaret. Her expression was a mix of sympathy and apprehension, as though she had heard this story before. "Blackridge Road has always been strange," she said, settling into a chair across from Clara. "You're not the first to come here shaken and confused. That road has a way of getting under your skin." Clara leaned forward, her eyes searching Margaret's face for answers. "Do you know what it is? The thing I saw? The man?" Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window as though expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. "We call him the Silent Stalker," she said finally, "but no one really knows what he is. Some say he's a ghost, a remnant of someone who died on that road. Others think he's something else entirely, something older and far more dangerous." Clara's grip tightened on the teacup. "He wasn't alone," she said quietly. "There was another figure, smaller, different. Do you know anything about that?" Margaret's expression darkened. "I've heard whispers of others, shadows that move with him, like extensions of his will. But no one's ever been able to explain what they are or why they appeared. All I know is that once you've seen him, he'll follow you." The words sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She set the cup down on the table, her appetite for tea gone. "Is there any way to stop him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's silence was answer enough. She reached out and placed a hand on Clara's arm, her grip firm. "The only thing you can do is keep moving. Stay in the light. Don't let him catch you in the dark." As the night stretched on, Margaret's unease seemed to grow. She kept glancing at the windows and the door, her movements jittery and tense. Clara's nerves were already frayed, and Margaret's behavior only made things worse. When a clock on the mantel chimed midnight, Margaret stood abruptly. "You should get some rest," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll prepare a room for you." Clara nodded reluctantly, too exhausted to protest. Margaret led her upstairs to a small, tidy bedroom at the end of the hall. The bed was covered with a patchwork quilt, and a single lamp cast a warm glow over the room. Clara thanked Margaret, who lingered in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "If you hear anything during the night," Margaret said softly, don't open the door. No matter what. Clara's stomach twisted at the warning. What do you mean? Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. Just promise me you won't open it, she said before closing the door and leaving Clara alone. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Clara lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as Margaret's warning replayed in her mind. The house was silent except for the faint creaks of the wooden floorboards and the occasional pop of the fire downstairs. But as the hours dragged on, the silence became oppressive, the kind that made every small noise seem deafening. Around 2 a.m., Clara was jolted awake by a sound outside her door. It was faint at first, a soft rustling like fabric brushing against wood. Her heart pounded as she sat up, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, more distinct, until she could make out the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway. Clara's breath hitched. She remembered Margaret's warning and froze. Her eyes locked on the door. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as though whoever was out there was waiting for her to make a move. A cold sweat broke out on her skin as the doorknob rattled, the sound sending a jolt of terror through her. "Clara," a voice whispered, soft and eerily familiar. "It's me. Open the door." Her blood ran cold. It was Margaret's voice, but something about it was wrong. The tone was off, hollow and strained, like someone trying to mimic her. Clara's hands clenched the quilt as she fought the urge to respond. "Clara," the voice said again, more insistent this time. "Please, I need your help." Tears pricked at Clara's eyes as she shook her head, her body trembling. "No," she whispered to herself. "It's not her." The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, followed by a series of sharp knocks. "Open the door, Clara," the voice demanded, the desperation in its tone almost convincing. Almost. Clara covered her ears, trying to block out the sound. She closed her eyes tightly, willing it to stop. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, until it abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was suffocating, and Clara's heart raced as she waited for the next sound. Minutes passed, then an hour, but nothing happened. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, Clara finally allowed herself to relax. She climbed out of bed on shaky legs and opened the door cautiously. The hallway was empty, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. Downstairs, Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked up as Clara entered, her face pale and drawn. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked. Clara nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "It sounded like you, but I knew it wasn't." Margaret's grip on the teacup tightened. "They'll do that," she said. "They'll use any voice, any face, to lure you out. But you didn't open the door. That's what matters." Clara sat down across from her, the events of the night weighing heavily on her. "What happens now?" she asked. Margaret sighed. "Now, you have to leave. The stalker won't stop, and neither will his shadows. The longer you stay here, the more dangerous it becomes." Clara's stomach twisted with fear, but she knew Margaret was right. She had to keep moving, no matter how terrified she felt. The silent stalker wasn't going to let her go easily, and she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Margaret handed her a small, silver pendant etched with strange symbols. "Take this," she said. "It won't stop him, but it might buy you some time." Clara accepted the pendant, her fingers brushing over the cool metal. She didn't understand its significance, but she was willing to grasp at anything that might give her an edge. With Margaret's help, she packed up her things and the road stretched out before Clara, bathed in the gray light of dawn. Despite Margaret's reassurances, the pendant around her neck felt more like a fragile token than a genuine shield. She had left the small house behind, the warmth and relative safety fading with each mile. Now, she was back on Black Ridge Road, the forest closing in around her like the jaws of a trap. The silence in the car was unbearable. Clara turned on the radio, but all she got was static. She tried her phone again, holding her breath as the screen lit up. No signal. She tossed it onto the passenger seat with a frustrated sigh and gripped the steering wheel tighter. The road was eerily empty, the mist still clinging to the edges of her vision. It felt as though the world had been swallowed whole, leaving her as its only inhabitant. She glanced at the pendant, the intricate symbols etched into its surface glinting faintly in the pale light. Margaret had told her it would buy her time, but she hadn't explained how or why. Clara's fingers brushed against it absently as she drove, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of fear and determination. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a shadow darting across the road. Clara slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car skidded to a stop, the tires squealing on the damp pavement. She sat there, breathing heavily, her eyes scanning the road and the trees beyond. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the oppressive mist and the silence that pressed against her like a physical weight. "It's nothing," she muttered, trying to convince herself. "Just a trick of the light." But as she started to ease her foot off the brake, something moved in her peripheral vision. Her head snapped to the right, her eyes locking onto a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was him, the silent stalker. He was motionless, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. The long coat hung limply around him, and his presence sent a chill down Clara's spine. She pressed her foot down on the accelerator, the car lurching forward as she sped away. The figure disappeared into the mist, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Clara glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road. It was empty, but she knew better than to believe she had escaped. The miles blurred together as Clara drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The forest seemed to grow denser with each passing minute, the trees leaning in as though trying to block her path. The mist thickened, swirling around the car like a living thing. She felt trapped, caught in a nightmare that refused to end. Then the car began to sputter. "No, no, no," Clara whispered, panic rising in her chest. She glanced at the fuel gauge, but the needle was still hovering above empty. The engine coughed and groaned, the car losing speed despite her efforts to keep it moving. Finally, with a shuddering gasp, it came to a stop. Clara sat there, gripping the wheel as though it could somehow restart the car. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the cooling engine. She reached for her phone, but the screen still displayed no service. "Perfect," she muttered, her voice shaking. She looked out the window, the mist pressing against the glass like a living thing. The forest was unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that set her teeth on edge. Clara's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. She could stay in the car and wait for help, but the thought of being trapped here, alone and vulnerable, was unbearable. Taking a deep breath, she reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a flashlight. The beam cut through the mist as she stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin. She wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to shift at the edge of her vision. The pendant felt heavy against her chest, a small comfort in the face of the growing dread. Just find a signal, she told herself. Call for help and get out of here. She started walking, the flashlight beam bouncing across the uneven pavement. The mist swallowed the sound of her footsteps, leaving her feeling disconnected from the world around her. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent her heart racing. She turned the flashlight toward the forest, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Or so she hoped. The road stretched on, empty and endless. Clara's breath came in short gasps as the oppressive silence pressed down on her. She kept her eyes on the ground, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. But the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore, a prickling sensation at the back of her neck that made her skin crawl. Then she heard it, the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of her heart, but they grew louder, more deliberate, echoing in the stillness. Clara froze, her flashlight beam trembling as she swept it across the road. The footsteps stopped. "Who's there?" she called, her voice cracking. The only response was the echo of her own words, swallowed by the mist. She took a step back, her hand tightening around the flashlight. The footsteps resumed, closer this time, their rhythm steady and unyielding. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears as she turned and ran, the beam of light bobbing wildly in front of her. The footsteps followed, relentless and unhurried, as though they knew she had nowhere to go. Clara's foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. The flashlight clattered to the ground, its beam flickering. She scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking as she grabbed the flashlight and swung it around. The road was empty, the forest was silent, but the footsteps had stopped, and the air felt charged with an unseen presence. "Leave me alone," she screamed, her voice echoing into the void. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara's breaths came in ragged gasps as she backed away, her flashlight casting erratic shadows across the trees. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the mist. It was the stalker, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. He stood motionless, his presence radiating a cold, oppressive energy that made Clara's skin crawl. She turned and ran, her legs burning as she pushed herself forward. The road seemed endless, the mist thickening with each step, the pendant bounce against her chest, its weight a constant reminder of Margaret's words. Stay in the light. Don't let him catch you in the dark. Clara's flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with each passing second. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with the switch, desperate to keep the light alive. But the darkness closed in, the mist swallowing the weak glow until she was left in near-total blackness. The footsteps returned, louder and closer than before. Clara's heart pounded as she stumbled forward, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. She could feel him behind her, his presence pressing against her like a weight she couldn't escape. Then, just as she thought she couldn't go any further, a faint light appeared in the distance. Clara's chest heaved with relief as she pushed herself toward it, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The light grew brighter, cutting through the mist and illuminating a small cabin at the edge of the road. Only response was the low growl of the engine and the relentless hum of the tires on the pavement. As the road twisted and turned, Clara's thoughts grew more frantic. She couldn't keep driving like this, not without a destination. She needed to find help, or at least a place to stop and think. But the road offered no signs, no exits, no indication of where it might lead. It was as if she were caught in an endless loop, trapped on Blackridge Road with no way out. The mist began to thin slightly, revealing a faint glow in the distance. Clara's heart leapt at the sight, hope surging through her chest. It looked like a house, its windows glowing warmly against the darkness. She pressed on, the car's engine roaring as she closed the distance. As she approached, the outline of the house became clearer. It was small and unassuming, nestled among the trees like a beacon of safety. Clara pulled into the gravel driveway, her tires crunching loudly in the still night. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. It felt too good to be true, but she had no other choice. Gathering her courage, Clara stepped out of the car and approached the front door. The warm glow from the windows spilled onto the porch, and for the first time in hours, she felt a flicker of relief. She knocked, the sound echoing faintly. The door creaked open, and a middle-aged woman appeared, her expression one of mild surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice kind but wary. Clara hesitated, unsure how to explain what had happened. I'm sorry to bother you," she began, "but I've been driving on Blackridge Road, and I think someone's been following me." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "You look like you've been through hell." Clara stepped inside, the warmth of the house washing over her like a balm. But even as the door closed behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly escaped Blackridge Road. Not yet. The warmth of the small house enveloped Clara like a blanket, momentarily pushing away the oppressive chill of Blackridge Road. The living room was cozy, filled with mismatched furniture and the scent of freshly brewed tea. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, its glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. The middle-aged woman who had opened the door motioned for Clara to sit on a well-worn sofa. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the woman said, her voice tinged with concern as she handed Clara a steaming cup of tea. Clara managed a weak smile. "I'm not sure what I've seen," she admitted, her hands trembling as she took the cup. "But something out there, it's not right." The woman nodded knowingly and introduced herself as Margaret. Her expression was a mix of sympathy and apprehension, as though she had heard this story before. "Blackridge Road has always been strange," she said, settling into a chair across from Clara. "You're not the first to come here shaken and confused. That road has a way of getting under your skin." Clara leaned forward, her eyes searching Margaret's face for answers. "Do you know what it is? The thing I saw?" "The man." Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window as though expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. "We call him the Silent Stalker," she said finally, "but no one really knows what he is. Some say he's a ghost, a remnant of someone who died on that road. Others think he's something else entirely, something older and far more dangerous." Clara's grip tightened on the teacup. "He wasn't alone," she said quietly. "There was another figure. Smaller, different. Do you know anything about that?" Margaret's expression darkened. "I've heard whispers of others, shadows that move with him, like extensions of his will. But no one's ever been able to explain what they are or why they appear. All I know is that once you've seen him, he'll follow you." The words sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She set the cup down on the table, her appetite for tea gone. "Is there any way to stop him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's silence was answer enough. She reached out and placed a hand on Clara's arm, her grip firm. "The only thing you can do is keep moving. Stay in the light. Don't let him catch you in the dark." As the night stretched on, Margaret's unease seemed to grow. She kept glancing at the windows and the door, her movements jittery and tense. Clara's nerves were already frayed, and Margaret's behavior only made things worse. When a clock on the mantel chimed midnight, Margaret stood abruptly. "You should get some rest," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll prepare a room for you." Clara nodded reluctantly, too exhausted to protest. Margaret led her upstairs to a small, tidy bedroom at the end of the hall. The bed was covered with a patchwork quilt, and a single lamp cast a warm glow over the room. Clara thanked Margaret, who lingered in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "If you hear anything during the night," Margaret said softly, "don't open the door. No matter what." Clara's stomach twisted at the warning. "What do you mean?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just promise me you won't open it," she said before closing the door and leaving Clara alone. She reached the door and pounded on it with both fists. "Help me. Please, let me in," she cried, her voice breaking. The footsteps were right behind her now, the sound drilling into her mind. The door swung open, and a man appeared, his face lined with worry. He grabbed Clara's arm and pulled her inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it in one swift motion. The footsteps stopped, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable. Clara collapsed onto the floor, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The man knelt beside her, his expression grim. "You've seen him, haven't you?" he asked. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He's been following me. I don't know what to do." The man's jaw tightened. "You're not safe here," he said. "None of us are, but there might be a way to stop him." Clara's eyes widened, hope flickering in the depths of her despair. "How?" she whispered. The man glanced at the window, the mist pressing against the glass like a living thing. "It won't be easy," he said, "but if you're willing to fight, we might have a chance." Clara leaned against the wall of the cabin, her chest heaving as she tried to calm her erratic breathing. The faint glow of a single lantern illuminated the small interior, casting long shadows that flickered and danced with every movement. The man who had pulled her inside, a rugged, middle-aged figure with a weathered face and piercing eyes, paced near the window, occasionally peering out into the mist that clung to the cabin like a second skin. "Do you think it's still out there?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man glanced at her, his expression grim. "It doesn't just go away," he said. "Once the stalker marks you, it doesn't stop until it gets what it wants." A cold shiver ran down Clara's spine. "And what does it want?" The man's jaw tightened. "That depends on who you ask. Some say it's after your soul. Others think it's feeding off your fear. All I know is that it doesn't stop until you confront it." Clara's stomach churned at the thought. "How do you know so much about it?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Because I've seen it before. I've lived on Black Ridge Road my whole life, and I've lost people to that thing. Friends, neighbors, my wife." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Clara's fingers tightened around the pendant Margaret had given her, its cool surface grounding her in the moment. "Is there any way to stop it?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man nodded slowly. "There's a way," he said, "but it's dangerous, and it means going back out there." Clara's heart sank. The thought of facing the stalker again was almost too much to bear, but she knew she couldn't keep running forever. "What do I have to do?" The man pulled a map from a drawer and spread it out on the small table. The paper was worn and creased, marked with handwritten notes and symbols. He pointed to a spot deep within the forest. "There's an old chapel here," he said. "It's been abandoned for decades, but it's said to be a place of power. If we can lure the stalker there, we might be able to trap it." Clara frowned, her eyes scanning the map. "Trap it how?" "With a ritual," the man explained. "The chapel's altar is inscribed with ancient symbols, the same kind of symbols on that pendant you're wearing. If we can activate the altar, it might be enough to bind the stalker." "Might," Clara echoed, her voice rising. "You're not even sure this will work." The man met her gaze, his eyes steady. "Nothing about this is certain," he said, "but it's the only chance you have." Clara swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She didn't want to go back into the mist, to face the thing that had been haunting her every step. But she knew he was right. There was no other way. They set out just before sunrise, the pale light filtering through the mist in ghostly beams. The man, who introduced himself as Henry, carried a worn leather bag filled with supplies, candles, chalk, and a weathered book that looked as though it had been pulled from another century. Clara clutched the flashlight and pendant, her hands trembling as they walked into the dense forest. The path to the chapel was overgrown and treacherous, the ground uneven and littered with roots that seemed to reach out to trip them. The mist hung thick and heavy, muffling every sound except for their own footsteps. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the shadows, half expecting the stalker to emerge at any moment. "Stay close," Henry said, his voice low. "It feeds on fear, but it won't attack unless it thinks it has the upper hand. If we stick together, we'll be harder to isolate." Clara nodded, though her fear was already clawing at the edges of her mind. The silence of the forest was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. Every noise set her on edge, her grip on the flashlight tightening with each step. After what felt like hours, they reached the chapel. The building was small and decrepit, its stone walls covered in moss and ivy. The wooden door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly as a wind pushed against it. Henry stepped forward, pushing the door open fully to reveal a dim interior lit by the weak light filtering through broken stained glass windows. The air inside was cold and heavy, carrying the faint scent of decay. At the center of the room stood an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with the same symbols that adorned Clara's pendant. Henry approached it cautiously, setting the leather bag down and pulling out the supplies. "We don't have much time," he said, arranging the candles in a circle around the altar. "Once we start the ritual, the stalker will come. You need to be ready." Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Ready for what?" Henry looked at her, his expression grave. "To face it. The stalker is drawn to you, not me. It'll focus on you during the ritual, trying to break your will. You have to hold your ground. If you give in to the fear, it'll win. Clara's hands trembled as she nodded, her stomach twisting with dread. She watched as Henry drew a series of intricate symbols on the altar with the chalk, his movements precise and deliberate. The air seemed to grow heavier with each stroke, the room filling with an unspoken tension. When everything was ready, Henry lit the candles and opened the weathered book. The pages were filled with strange, flowing script that Clara couldn't read. But the words he spoke carried a weight that sent shivers down her spine. The symbols on the altar began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the cadence of Henry's voice. And then the footsteps began. They echoed through the chapel, slow and deliberate, growing louder with each passing moment. Clara's breath hitched as she turned toward the door, the flashlight shaking in her hands. The mist outside seemed to thicken, pressing against the broken windows like a living thing. The stalker appeared in the doorway, its form framed by the pale light of dawn. It was larger than Clara remembered, its presence filling the room with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. The brim of its hat cast a shadow over its face, but Clara could feel its gaze piercing through her. "Hold your ground," Henry said firmly, his voice cutting through her rising panic. "Don't let it break you." The stalker stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Clara's legs felt like lead as she forced herself to stand her ground, her fingers clutching the pendant tightly. The air around her grew colder with each step it took, the mist swirling around its form like a shroud. Henry's voice grew louder, the ancient words reverberating through the chapel. The symbols on the altar flared brightly, casting an otherworldly glow that seemed to push back against the stalker's presence. The creature hesitated, its form flickering as though caught between two worlds. "Now, Clara," Henry shouted. "Place the pendant on the altar." Clara's heart pounded as she stepped forward, the pendant feeling like a weight in her hand. The stalker let out a low, guttural sound, its shadowy form stretching toward her as if to stop her. Summoning every ounce of courage, she slammed the pendant onto the altar. The reaction was immediate. The symbols flared with blinding light, and the stalker let out a deafening roar. Its form twisted and writhed, the mist around it churning violently. The ground beneath the chapel shook as the creature was pulled toward the altar, its resistance growing weaker with each passing second. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, the stalker was gone. The mist dissipated, and the chapel fell silent. Clara collapsed to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression one of relief and exhaustion. "You did it," he said quietly. "It's over." Clara looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Is it really over?" Henry's gaze shifted to the altar, where the pendant now lay dark and inert. "For now," he said. "But things like this, they never stay gone forever. You face it once. You can face it again if you have to." Clara nodded, the weight of his words settling over her. She had survived the silent stalker, but she knew her journey was far from over. The air inside the chapel remained heavy, the faint glow of the altar's symbols flickering before fading into darkness. Clara sat on the cold stone floor, her breath shallow and uneven as she tried to process what had just happened. The silent stalker's roar still echoed in her ears, and though it was gone, the oppressive energy it left behind lingered like a specter. Henry paced the room, his hands trembling as he packed the ritual supplies back into his worn leather bag. The light filtering through the broken windows was brighter now, signaling that the dawn had fully arrived. But even the sunlight seemed unable to pierce the lingering shadows in the corners of the room. "It's gone," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We stopped it." Henry paused, his back to her. "We bought ourselves time," he said, his tone grave. "But something like that, it doesn't stay gone. Not for long." Clara's stomach twisted. "So what now?" she asked, her hands gripping the edge of the altar as she pulled herself to her feet. Henry turned to face her, his expression weary but resolute. Now, we make sure it doesn't come back stronger. The ritual bounded, but the connection between you and the stalker hasn't been severed completely. If we don't finish this, it'll find a way to return. Clara's heart sank. The thought of facing the stalker again was almost too much to bear, but she knew she had no choice. What do we have to do? Henry pulled a small, leather-bound journal from his bag and flipped through its worn pages. The script inside was written in a language Clara couldn't understand, but the symbols and diagrams were eerily familiar. He stopped on a page marked with a faded ribbon and pointed to a sketch of a stone obelisk surrounded by runes. "There's a place deeper in the forest," Henry said. "An ancient site where the connection can be severed completely. It's dangerous, but it's the only way to end this for good." Clara stared at the sketch, her fear mounting. How dangerous? Henry's jaw tightened. "The stalker isn't the only thing tied to Blackridge Road," he said. "The site is a focal point for the kind of energy that allows things like it to exist. The closer we get, the stronger those forces will become. It'll try to stop us." Clara's pulse quickened, but she nodded. "Then we'd better get moving," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The forest was unnervingly quiet as they left the chapel behind. The path Henry led her down was narrow and overgrown, the trees forming a dense canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The mist had thinned slightly, but it still clung to the ground, swirling around their feet with every step. Clara clutched a flashlight in one hand and a pendant in the other, its cool surface a small comfort against a growing sense of unease. Henry walked ahead, his movements deliberate and unhurried, but his eyes were constantly scanning the shadows. "Stay close," he said over his shoulder. "The closer we get to the site, the harder it'll be to keep track of what's real and what isn't." Clara nodded, her gaze darting to the edges of the path. The trees seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, their gnarled branches twisting into shapes that made her stomach churn. Every so often, she thought she heard faint whispers just beyond the range of her hearing, but when she stopped to listen, there was nothing. The path grew steeper, the ground becoming uneven and treacherous. Clara stumbled several times, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled to keep up with Henry. The forest seemed to press in closer with each step, the air growing colder and heavier. They reached a clearing, and Clara froze. In the center stood a towering obelisk, just like the one in Henry's journal. Its surface was covered in runes that glowed faintly, pulsating with an unnatural light. The ground around it was bare, the grass and plants withered and dead. The air crackled with energy, making the hairs on the back of Clara's neck stand on end. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Henry nodded, his expression grim. "This is it." He stepped forward cautiously, pulling a piece of chalk from his bag. He began to draw a series of symbols on the ground around the obelisk, his movements precise and deliberate. Clara watched, her heart pounding as the whispers she had heard earlier grew louder. They weren't words, but they carried a weight that made her chest tighten. "What do I do?" Clara asked, her voice shaking. Henry didn't look up. "Stand by the obelisk," he said. "When I tell you, place the pendant on it. The energy from the site will amplify the binding spell and sever the stalker's connection to you." Clara nodded, stepping closer to the obelisk. The rune's glow intensified as she approached, their light casting eerie shadows across her face. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of sound that made her head throb. "Henry," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's happening." Henry looked up, his expression tense. "Hold your ground," he said firmly. "It's trying to scare you. Don't let it." The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to move, coalescing into shapes that sent a jolt of terror through Clara. Figures emerged, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. Their faces were blurred, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded the clearing, their gazes fixed on Clara. "Henry!" she shouted, her voice rising in panic. "Ignore them," Henry barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "They are not real." Clara's breathing was ragged as she fought the urge to run. The figures moved closer, their movements synchronized like marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. The whispers turned into screams, a deafening chorus that made her head feel like it was splitting open. "Now, Clara!" Henry shouted. "Place the pendant." Summoning every ounce of courage, Clara stepped forward and pressed the pendant against the surface of the obelisk. The runes flared with blinding light, and a wave of energy erupted from the stone, knocking her to the ground. The figures surrounding the clearing let out unearthly shrieks before dissolving into the mist. The light dimmed, and the whispers faded into silence. Clara lay on the ground, her chest heaving as she stared up at the obelisk. The runes had stopped glowing, their light extinguished. She turned to Henry, who was kneeling nearby, his face pale but determined. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's gaze shifted to the forest, where the mist was beginning to dissipate. "For now," he said, "but we've only just begun." The silence that followed the burst of light was deafening, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. Clara lay on the cold ground, her chest heaving and her mind racing to process what had just happened. The pendant lay lifeless on the obelisk, its once cool surface now warm to the touch. The runes had stopped glowing, their eerie light extinguished, leaving the clearing bathed in the muted glow of dawn. Henry slowly rose to his feet, his movements deliberate and cautious. He scanned the perimeter of the clearing, his hand resting on the hilt of a hunting knife strapped to his belt. The mist that had surrounded them earlier was beginning to lift, revealing the twisted, gnarled trees that had seemed almost alive moments before. Yet, despite the apparent calm, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. "Is it over?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. She pushed herself into a sitting position, her body aching from the force of the blast. Henry's eyes narrowed as he continued to survey their surroundings. "Not yet," he said grimly. "The ritual disrupted its connection, but it's not gone. It's weakened, but it's still here." Clara's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I thought the pendant." "The pendant was only the first step," Henry interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. "It severed the tether between you and the stalker, but the energy that sustains it is still tied to this place. We have to destroy that energy, or it will keep coming back." Clara's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run far away from this cursed road. But she knew that none of those things would help her. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Henry pointed to the obelisk. "The energy source is buried beneath this site," he said. "The obelisk is a conduit, a way for that energy to manifest in the physical world. If we destroy it, we destroy the stalker's ability to exist here." Clara's gaze shifted to the massive stone structure. It looked ancient, unyielding. How do we destroy something like that? Henry pulled a bundle of explosives from his bag. Their compact size belied the destructive power they contained. "We blow it up," he said simply. Clara's eyes widened. "You've had those this whole time." Henry shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Always be prepared," he said. "Now, help me set these up. We need to work fast." The process of placing the explosives was nerve-wracking. Henry worked quickly, his movements precise and practiced, while Clara followed his instructions as best she could. Each time she crouched near the obelisk, she felt a cold, almost electric sensation prickling at her skin, as if the structure were aware of what they were doing. As they worked, the forest seemed to come alive again. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder with each passing moment. Shadows began to flicker at the edges of Clara's vision, darting between the trees like phantoms. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the task at hand, but her fear was mounting with every second. "Henry," she said, her voice trembling, "I think it knows what we're doing." "Let it," Henry replied without looking up. "We're almost done." The final explosive was placed at the base of the obelisk. its wires connected to a small detonator. Henry stood and took a step back, his eyes locked on the structure. "That should do it," he said. "Now we just need to get to a safe distance." But before they could move, the air around them grew impossibly cold. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Clara spun around, her flashlight cutting through the mist, and her heart stopped. The stalker had returned. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its shadowy form towering over the trees. Its wide-brimmed hat and long coat were unmistakable, but its appearance had changed. It was larger now, its edges blurred and shifting like smoke. The faint red glow of its eyes burned through the mist, locking onto Clara with a predatory intensity. "Get behind me!" Henry shouted, pulling the hunting knife from his belt. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled to position herself behind Henry, her hands clutching the pendant so tightly that the edges dug into her palm. The stalker began to move, its footsteps echoing like thunder as it advanced toward them. Henry held his ground, the knife glinting in the dim light. "We've got to hold it off until the charges go off," he said, his voice steady despite the fear Clara could see in his eyes. "Stay close and don't let it separate us." The stalker's form shifted as it closed the distance, tendrils of shadow lashing out like whips. One of them struck the ground near Henry, sending a spray of dirt and debris into the air. He lunged forward, slashing at the tendrils with the knife, the blade cutting through them as if they were made of smoke. Clara's heart pounded as she fumbled for the detonator in Henry's bag. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she tried to steady herself. "Henry, I've got it," she shouted. "Good," he called back, his focus never wavering from the stalker. "When I say now, hit the switch and don't look back." The stalker let out a guttural roar, its tendrils lashing out in a frenzy. One of them struck Henry, sending him sprawling to the ground. Clara screamed, rushing to his side as he struggled to get up. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, but he waved her off. "Do it, Clara," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Now!" Clara's fingers tightened around the detonator. She glanced at Henry one last time before pressing the button. The explosion that followed was deafening, a blinding flash of light that consumed the obelisk and sent a shockwave rippling through the clearing. Clara was thrown backward, her head striking the ground as the world went dark. When Clara opened her eyes, the clearing was eerily quiet. The obelisk was gone, reduced to a smoldering crater in the earth. The runes that had once glowed with unnatural light were no more, their power extinguished. The stalker was nowhere to be seen. Henry lay a few feet away, motionless. Clara crawled to his side, her hands shaking as she checked for a pulse. Relief washed over her when she felt the faint but steady rhythm beneath her fingers. "Henry," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Wake up." He stirred, groaning as he opened his eyes. Did we get it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's gone," she said. "You did it." Henry managed a weak smile before his eyes drifted closed again. Clara sat beside him, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The forest around them was silent. The oppressive energy that had haunted Black Ridge Road finally lifted. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Clara allowed herself to hope that it was truly over. The sun was beginning its slow ascent, casting golden rays through the thinning canopy of trees as Clara and Henry made their way back to the road. The air felt lighter now, free of the oppressive weight that had hung over them since the journey began. The mist that had once choked the forest had dissipated, leaving behind a sense of clarity and peace that felt almost alien. Henry leaned heavily on Clara, his injuries slowing their progress. Blood from the gash on his forehead had dried, leaving a dark streak down the side of his face. His breathing was labored, but his steps were steady, driven by the same determination that had carried him through the ritual. "We did it," Clara said softly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It's really over." Henry gave a faint nod, his eyes scanning the forest as though expecting some lingering shadow to emerge. "For now," he replied. But things like the stalker, they leave marks. This road, this place, it'll never be completely free. Clara's grip on his arm tightened. What do you mean? Evil like that doesn't just disappear, Henry said. It's part of the land now, woven into the fabric of this place. The stalker might be gone, but something else could take its place. Or maybe, he hesitated, his expression darkening. Maybe it's waiting for the right time to return. Clara swallowed hard, her gaze drifting to the path ahead. The thought of another encounter, another battle with forces she barely understood, made her stomach churn. But she knew Henry was right. The fight wasn't over. Not really. It never would be. By the time they reached Clara's car, the sun was fully above the horizon, its light painting the world in warm, vibrant hues. The vehicle sat where she had left it, a lone sentinel on the edge of the forest. Clara helped Henry into the passenger seat before collapsing into the driver's side, her hands gripping the wheel as she tried to steady her breathing. "We should get you to a hospital," she said, glancing at Henry. His face was pale, but he managed a faint smile. "I'll be fine," he said. "I've been through worse." Clara wasn't convinced, but she didn't argue. She started the engine, the familiar hum breaking the forest silence. As the car pulled onto the road, she couldn't resist a final glance in the rearview mirror. The forest loomed behind them, its shadows stretching like grasping fingers. But there was no sign of the stalker, no flicker of movement in the trees. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Clara asked, her voice tentative. Henry let out a dry chuckle. "No," he said simply, "and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left unknown." Clara nodded, her thoughts drifting to the pendant that now sat in her lap. Its once glowing symbols were dull, but it still felt heavy with significance. She wondered what would become of it, whether it would serve as a warning or a weapon in the battles yet to come. They drove in silence for miles, the forest gradually giving way to open fields and scattered houses. Clara's exhaustion began to catch up with her, the adrenaline that had fueled her through the night fading into a heavy, bone-deep fatigue. Henry dozed beside her, his head resting against the window, his breathing shallow but steady. As they reached the outskirts of a small town, Clara spotted a diner with a handful of cars parked outside. She pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under the tires. Henry stirred, blinking groggily as the car came to a stop. "Food," Clara said, managing a small smile. "And coffee. Lots of coffee." Henry nodded, his movement slow as he climbed out of the car. They entered the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly. The smell of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee greeted them, a welcome contrast to the damp, earthy scent of the forest. The waitress, a cheerful woman in her 40s, approached with a pot of coffee and a warm smile. "Rough night?" she asked, her eyes flicking to Henry's bandaged head. "You could say that," Clara replied, her tone light despite the weight of the night's events. They ordered breakfast, the simple act of sitting at a table and eating grounding them in a way that felt almost surreal. For the first time in hours, Clara allowed herself to relax, the tension in her shoulders easing as the warmth of the coffee spread through her. Henry's gaze drifted to the window, his expression distant. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice low. Clara considered the question, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to pretend none of this ever happened, to go back to my life and forget Blackridge Road even exists." Henry nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "And the other part," Clara sighed. "The other part knows that's impossible. After everything I've seen, I can't just walk away. Not if there's a chance someone else could go through what I did." A small smile touched Henry's lips. "You've got a good heart," he said. "But this isn't an easy path. It'll take everything you have, and then some." Clara met his gaze, her determination shining through her exhaustion. "Then I guess I'd better be ready." As they left the diner, the world felt brighter, more alive. The horrors of Blackridge Road were behind them, but Clara knew they would never truly leave her. They were etched into her memory, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of the world. Henry placed a hand on her shoulder as they stood by the car. "If you ever need help," he said, "you know where to find me." Clara nodded, her grip on the pendant tightening. "Same goes for you," she said. They parted ways, Henry heading to a nearby motel while Clara prepared for the long drive home. As she pulled onto the highway, she couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror. The road stretched out behind her, empty and quiet. But in her mind, the shadows of Blackridge Road would always linger. And as the pendant grew warm in her hand, Clara realized that her journey wasn't ending. It was just beginning.